open with me, please, first of all, to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 29. Verse 2, when the righteous increase, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, people groan. When the righteous increase, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, people groan. People groan when there's a wicked leader, a wicked president, a wicked king, a wicked prime minister, a wicked first minister. People groan. We've seen this here in Scotland with the Scottish National Party, two of their leaders in a row. The people groaned. We see this with the present Prime Minister of Great Britain. The people groan. We see this in many countries, in many places. The people groan. Things go wrong and the people groan. But the failure of a leader to perform is inevitably related to a lack of righteousness, not just a lack of competence. If somebody was indeed righteous and lacked competence, their righteousness would make them realize that they're not suitable for the position. But unrighteous people want power. They want position. And that is one of the first things the Word of God tells us about government. Look with me, please, to 1 Samuel chapter 8. We'll begin in verse 10. So Samuel the prophet spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. And he said, this will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among the horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. And he will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. But he will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, for you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us. People look to a human leader, They look to a strong man. When people look for a strong man to solve their problems, to take responsibility for their lives, they think by choosing a particular leader, everything is going to be all right. It always spells trouble. Not just historically or philosophically or practically in the outworkings of economy and politics, but there's a spiritual dimension to it. People are not looking to God. There have been those who have had a biblical perspective of government. They may have made mistakes, and they did make mistakes, but they understood the relationship between theology and polity. Israel, of course, was a theocratic state. The church is not, and whenever the church has sought to become a political power, it has created problems. Erastianism, a state church, is not scriptural. The United States was founded on the idea that Congress shall not make a law concerning the establishment of religion. They didn't want a Lutheran church like Germany has, or a Catholic national religion like the Catholic countries of Europe had. They didn't want an Episcopalian or an Anglican religion as England had, or a Presbyterian one like Scotland had. They saw the wars that this created in Europe. And so the founding fathers said, you can have any religion you want, but it will not be an agency of the state, and the state will not be an agency of the church. We will run the state on biblical principles. Even the deists and those who were not really Christians understood the value and importance of biblical principles. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He was not a Christian. However, he did give New Testaments to North American Indians, Native Americans. He understood the importance of the Judeo-Christian moral values. All of the founding fathers of America did, although some of them did have a personal faith. Many of them certainly did not, but they all acknowledged the importance of the Judeo-Christian moral teaching. They didn't want a state church. They didn't want this identification. They did not want it. They did not want Erastianism. They did not want a Church of England or a Church of Scotland. They didn't want these things. These things were always problematic. The conflict between Mary, Queen of Scots, and John Knox in Scotland is one example. But it went beyond that. You had English Puritan Calvinists and Scottish Presbyterian Calvinists, both of them Calvinistic Protestants, both of them professing to be regenerate Christians, born again, both of them. And they claimed to have a biblically based faith, which they united with government. And in this situation, the English Puritan Calvinists, who claimed to be believers, they claimed to be saved Christians, and the Presbyterian Calvinists, who made the same claim, massacred each other. They had a vile war massacring each other in the name of Jesus Christ. Not just Protestant against Protestant, evangelical against evangelical, and Calvinist against Calvinist. The American founding fathers did not want this. They understood the importance of biblical values and faith in God. Both the American Constitution in its preamble and the Declaration of Independence are theistic documents. As we've said before, they are predicated on theistic presuppositions. All men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The belief that rights came from God, not from government. Rights came from God, not from government. The Puritans in England, who established parliamentary democracy, again, made many mistakes and had many faults. They were not a theological monolith. There were Puritans who were far more moderate, such as Richard Baxter and Joseph Alleine. There were others who were more extreme, like John Owen, and some of the people who surrounded Oliver Cromwell. And there were others who were in between. There were, in that era, Baptists who had Puritan leanings, like John Bunyan. They were not a monolith. They were not all the same. But the unification of religion and government, which was very Calvinistic in England, as it was in Scotland, led to things like the witch hunter general torturing old ladies and drowning them and things like this, and accusing them of being witches based on spectral evidence. This, of course, spread to colonial America, to Massachusetts, Salem, Massachusetts area, by the Puritans who came to America fleeing the persecution of King James. Of the King James Bible, they fled. They had their own translation of the Bible, the Geneva Bible, that came from Geneva, where English Christians fled to escape the Roman Catholic persecution of Queen Mary I of Mary, not Mary, Queen of Scots, the English Mary, sister of Elizabeth. And so they were at odds with King James. And again, it was the same thing, the Anglicans fighting the Puritans. And this eventually came to the English Civil War. But then the Puritans got power, and they had witch hunter generals and things like this. They had a Taliban-type regime based on Cromwell's Geneva, similar to Sharia in Islam, just as oppressive. I'm not saying all the Puritans were of that extreme, but once they got into government and power, terrible things happened, including wars with other Calvinists. And the plantation period and expropriation of land in Ireland. They just said the wealth of the wicked stored up for the righteous. The Irish are mostly Catholics. They're the wicked, we're the righteous, so we can take their land. And all of a sudden, Derry becomes Londonderry. And they just made these plantations. To this very day, the problems in Ireland that we've seen, the so-called troubles of our lifetime, date back to this period. It is an ugly history whenever the church vied for political power. Yet even the Puritans realized that the warning about a king, when they executed Charles I, Cromwell called himself Lord Protector. He refused to be called king. He called himself the Lord Protector. In the period in between Charles I and the restoration of his son, Charles II, when again the Episcopals, that is the Anglicans, got the upper hand again. It was a very complicated mess. But for all their many faults, the Puritans realized that for democracy to work, we must be governed by men who are governed by God. Pater Noster Quies Ancelius, as you've heard me say, was engraved and is still engraved on the external walls of Westminster Palace, the Houses of Parliament. There it is. The Puritans understood this, that without the Judeo-Christian faith, Christianity could not work. We must be governed by men who are governed by God, and I'm not discounting their failures. It was very much from Protestantism, and often an evangelically focused Protestantism, that democracy emerged. Great Britain, England initially, and Scotland, they gave the world parliamentary democracy. UK, Great Britain, the British Commonwealth, the British Empire. What we call today the UK bequeathed parliamentary democracy to the countries that have a parliamentary system of democracy. The United States was different. It was a republic. There was not to be any constitutional monarch, a king or any queen or anything like this. America was republican and constitutional. Britain did not have a per se constitution. It did have, of course, the Magna Carta, and there were principles of law derived from the Magna Carta, limiting the powers of the monarchy and the government and so forth. But the United States was a constitutional republic, a presidential democracy that was a constitutional republic. Constitutional republic was a form of democracy bequeathed to the world by the United States. Parliamentary democracy was bequeathed to the world by Great Britain. With this came a constitutional or a titular monarchy, a constitutional monarchy. Again, Britain does not have a per se constitution, but it has a constitutional monarchy. That's just what they call it. The monarchy cannot usurp the power of Parliament. Now, of course, there were battles in British history going back and forth between George III and Parliament and others, and all the way to the time of Victoria. The monarchy still had an important political voice in Great Britain. Nonetheless, you wind up with a parliamentary democracy from Britain. and Australia and Commonwealth countries of Great Britain follow this. The United States was a constitutional republic. It was presidential. The French, they have a combination of the two. They combine presidential and parliamentary. They have both the prime minister and a president. It's more complicated, and it's influenced by the Napoleonic code of law. Nonetheless, that is some separate issue. There's no doubt that Protestantism gave rise to a worldview and a philosophical view of society and nationhood that saw the rise of democracy in both America and in Britain, and other countries copied it. This is absolutely true, which is not to deny the faults on both sides of the Atlantic and the failures, but it is not to deny the successes either. Yet, they both had a theological premise to their philosophy of government, both the British and the Americans. Once that goes, as we've said before, democracy is going to go, and democracy is going. Here in Britain, it's Guy Fawkes Night. Now, Guy Fawkes is sort of like the American 4th of July, a celebration of democracy with fireworks. Different time of year. America, it's the peak of the summer holiday and vacation season with the fireworks and so forth. In Britain, it was when they celebrate the victory over the gunpowder plot, when Roman Catholic conspirators tried to overthrow the British government, assassinate the monarch, the government ministers, and the lords and the commons. They tried to blow up Parliament, and the plot was foiled. The person who was caught trying to do it was only one of about 8 people or so, and his name was Guy Fawkes. And kids would get a mannequin, or a dummy. They would make it and sew it together, and they bring it out on the street. They were still doing this even in my youth, and the English kids would be out there, penny for the guy, sir, penny for the guy, penny for the guy. They want people to give them a penny or a tuppence, a little bit of change, to buy firecrackers, and then they would blow up the guy, because he was going to blow up Parliament and destroy British democracy. And that's how Britain commemorates its democracy. And then they shoot the fireworks. The Americans commemorate their democracy by shooting the fireworks. These things are cultural. Unfortunately, most people no longer understand the history of how British democracy evolved and developed, and most people in the United States don't really understand how democracy evolved and developed. They don't understand the founding fathers. The British didn't understand the Puritan parliamentarians. They didn't understand these things. Most people don't. Some do, most do not. And the left wants to ignore it and discount it. They only want to look at the bad things. They don't want to look at the positive things. History must be honest, or it's not valid history. It's revisionism. Or, as Voltaire said, the lie everybody agrees on. It shouldn't be that. You've got to look at it comprehensively and see the positive and the negative. You must learn from the mistakes and the victories. Otherwise, you're not going to have your own victories, and you're going to repeat the mistakes. Now, that is true even in the secular realm of political philosophy. But it is no less true theologically. If the church does not learn the lessons of church history, it's going to repeat those mistakes. And it is going to deprive itself of the victories the church has had in spreading the gospel. But this goes back, of course, to learning from Israel. We are told this by Paul the Apostle in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The church should learn from the examples of Israel. Romans suggests we should learn from Israel in the positive as well as the negative sense. But in 1 Corinthians 10, we are warned not to make the same kinds of mistakes. Again, this is a passage I have frequently appealed to. These things happened in the wilderness to the Israelites as examples for us that we should not crave evil things as they craved, and do not be idolaters as some of them were, etc., etc. Verse 11 of 1 Corinthians 10. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. If the church does not learn the lessons of Israel, it's going to repeat them. So too, this was adopted. This was even adopted in the political realm. The founding fathers of America said, well, okay, the Puritans wanted to democratize England. There was a long effort to begin democracy going back to the Magna Carta, the 1200s. Okay, that was the first step towards democracy. They had this long tradition of trying to develop it, and they got some things right, but they got some things wrong. We have to learn from them. Again, this was a biblical way of thinking. It was a biblical way of thinking about government and law. That is largely lost. The Protestant democracies, the English-speaking democracies, America, Britain, Australia, Canada, etc., have largely abandoned any biblical perspective of understanding government and law. The heart of this in the Old Testament, or the commencement, the embodiment of it, the crystallization of it, is what we read in 1 Samuel chapter 8. It shows us something. Look to God, not to people. In the democratic model, the governments are to be the servants of the people. Thomas Jefferson went so far as to say and write that if the people do not enslave the government will enslave the people. If the people do not enslave the government will enslave the people. Those who want power. A statesman will want power because of servantship. A politician will want power because they want power. And that is usually aligned with the accumulation of wealth to the benefit of themselves and to their partners and backers. Let's look at this again. The king will reign. He'll take your sons and place for himself in his chariots, and among horsemen they will run before his chariots. The modern state of Israel has mandatory military service, but it is a reserve-based army. It is only a small number of professional soldiers, but a large number of reservists who train and who are mobilized in the event of a war. It was not to be a militaristic state, and the modern state of Israel is not a militaristic state. There's compulsive military service for most people, but once that is over, it's over. However, you stay in the reserves. They did not want a war machine. And they still don't have one, even though it is a formidable military power. It is a regional power. It's the strongest regional power in the Middle East, one of the strongest armies in the world. It does have a military-industrial complex, but nothing on the scale you'll find in America or Europe, much less in Russia or China. But let's look at this. Conscription. When this happened, it was bad. In England, if you read what happened, in the 18th century, they had pressmen, press gangs. I don't mean newspapers. They would just go around and find your son on your farm and drag him away and put him to sea in the Royal Navy. in the world. It was not a voluntary enlistment. It was not people electing to go into the military as a career. Now, in Israel today, you have something called keva. Keva. If you serve the military and you like it and you did a good job and they like you, you can be in keva. You can be part of this permanent elite military force. But everybody else goes to the reserves. Everybody else just goes to the reserves. They don't press people into it. You have to do your bit because the country's surrounded by enemies. That's necessary. You have to be in the military and train and learn the basic things that a soldier would have to learn. That is all true. But then they let you go. What happens when they won't let you go? Well, there's countries where that is the case. And that took place in much of the history of Great Britain and other countries. This kind of conscription, the press gangs, it went on. Now, it is pretty well proven that the people who re-enlist voluntarily, they like the military, they like their job, they are going to be professional soldiers, sailors, airmen. They're higher quality than draftees. They're higher quality people. They're professional soldiers. They're higher quality people than conscripts. One of the problems Putin is having now in the Ukraine, he's got an army of conscripts. He's taking people and conscripting them and putting them in a war that nobody's winning. Massive casualty rates. He's hiring mercenaries from North Korea. A big, big mess. They're not professional soldiers. They can't even beat the Ukraine, a much smaller country that is backed by the West. Well, a strong man like Putin, you're going to have what you have in Proverbs 8. It goes on. He'll appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and reap the harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. Notice it is his. It is not a people's army. It is not a defense force to protect the nation collectively. He sees it as his war machine. Hitler thinks of it as his Reich, his Wehrmacht, the Wehrmacht. That was Hitler's thinking. It was his. Stalin, it was his. The Red Army was his. Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese military, and Ping thinks it's his. Power corrupts that, and there is a truth in it. But what they're not looking at is the spiritual forces on back of it, the principalities that we see in the book of Daniel, and also the pride of fallen man when people want that kind of power. Jesus warned the leader must be the servant. If you want a position of leadership to be a servant, that is something that can be good. If you want a position of leadership to be served, that is something privileged. But they're not to be the overlords. They are to be the protectors of the people. But they're not. They do things not necessary for their protection. Hitler didn't have to invade countries like Norway and Poland and Denmark and Holland for his protection. Putin didn't have to invade the Ukraine for his protection. China didn't have to invade Tibet for its protection. No, this is what you get. People stop looking to God and they look to a man for a leader. Well, let's look. He builds a war machine. You'll see this when you have dictators. A dictator needs a war machine. That war machine may be used against external enemies of such a war machine is to use it against your own people. In other words, you turn the military into a police, a politically driven police force. Now, you see this played out throughout history. But the caveats, the warnings to this, come straight from Scripture. These things that these megalomaniac dictators have done is exactly what the Word of God warns they would do. Israel simply being the archetype or the microcosm. Let's look. He'll take your daughters and perfumers and cooks and bakers. He sees the people, men and women, as his personal labor force. Now, what happens in a war machine? He builds a war machine. What happens in a war machine? What happened in the United States and in Great Britain during the Second World War? It began in the First World War. The men were gone to war, so women became mechanics. They didn't actually become coal miners, but they did just about every other job a man would do. You had women doing men's jobs in factories and manufacturing and defense production, in plants. In the United States, the labor force that had been men is now women. In Britain, the labor force is now women. There were exceptions like the coal mines, but not much else. Once you build a war machine, you've got to get the labor force somewhere. So the wife is taken out of the home. The wife and mother is extracted. That's what happens. Now, I'm not saying America and Britain were wrong for doing it. They did it in self-defense. They were forced to do it. But if you're not doing it in self-defense, it's a bad thing to do. The Soviet Union did it. They had women doing everything. Women were in everything. The Soviets had their own kind of feminism. Anything a man can do, a woman can do. Because they needed the women for the labor force. The Soviets had women in combat brigades during the Second World War. But let's look. Verse 14, he'll take the best of your fields and your vineyards, your olive groves, and give them to his servants. What politicians will do is they will overtax in order to give contracts and remuneration packages and benefits to those who are part of their political machine. They will do things for their donors and benefactors. It becomes jobs for the boys. In Britain and in America, this has often been something that Masonic lodges played a role in. Related but separate subject. They are going to overtax in order not simply to maintain their war machine, but to maintain their political machine. It's about power. You just see the new budget. This woman reads 3 months ago. She was saying taxes are too high. No more tax increases. Taxes are too high already. 3 months ago. Now, her budget, 40 billion pounds in new taxes. 40 billion pounds. They're subsidizing benefits for illegal immigrants in both America and Britain. And they want the illegal immigrants for political purposes. They'll vote for us. It's about preservation of power. And they hand the people that are supposed to represent the bill. Well, let's look. The tithe was to go to the Lord. In verse 15, he'll take a tenth of your seed and your vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants, his bureaucrats. He'll take your male servants, your female servants, the best young men, your donkeys, and use them for his work. Remember, excessive taxation is nothing more than legalized theft. It is exploitation. It is legalized theft. Biden and Harris hired 81,000 armed Internal Revenue Service agents. Who are they going to go after? Major corporations? You don't need that many. They're going to go after working families. That is the nature. When you have people who are godless in power and in government. They want to deify themselves in the extremes. They become a Ceausescu or a Stalin or a Mussolini or a Hitler. An Il Duce, a Ceausescu. But let's look at this. Mao did the same. It goes on. He'll take a tenth of your flock, and you yourselves will become his servants. You're working for the government, but it's not your government. They tell you that they're your government. But if they were your government, they'd be working for you. No, you are working for them. When a society stops looking to God, when a society's laws stopped being built on his principles of morality, righteousness, and justice, this is what you're going to wind up with. You're a father or mother? You like your little girl having to share locker room facilities and shower facilities in school for sports with a biological male? You like contact sports where your daughter has to compete with a biological male? This is a complete abrogation of biblical principle and normalcy. How do you get such a crazy thing? How do you get governments that promote it and allow it in courts? Easy. Read 1 Samuel chapter 8. It goes on. You will become his servants. The government won't be servants of the people. They call themselves civil servants. One, there's nothing civil about them. You have a two-tier law enforcement system in Britain and in America, a two-tier system. Bogus prosecutions that are politically motivated. They're not your servants, and they are not civil. In the civil service, they're not civil and they're not servants. They're uncivil, and you're the servant. Then you will cry out in the day because of your king that you've chosen. You cry out. Verse 18. But the Lord will not answer you. He won't answer you. You look at this. You had a godless man, an evil man who supported partial birth abortion. Most of the babies aborted in America are minorities, and most of those black. Pulling a black baby through the birth canal with forceps, doing a suboccipital puncture, and sucking the baby's brains out while it's alive was supported by Barack Obama. Late term. Cruelty and barbarity to babies, a disproportionately large amount of them black. And of course, those who oppose it are called racists and bigots. Well, after 2 terms of Mr. Obama, that 98% of American blacks voted for, after 2 terms, the average black American family's income went down by $900 a year. Look what happened in Britain with Starmer. Look at this budget. Look what it's going to do to farmers. Remember, the first profession was farming. The first profession was farming. God put Adam in the garden and told him to take care of it. Food production was the first occupation. Some people tried to say prostitution is the oldest profession in the world. No, it's not. It's farming. In the millennial reign of Christ, we're not going to need lawyers and doctors, but we're going to need farmers. Britain had a problem. When Britain was still in the EU, Britain was penalized for having the most productive farms in Europe. British farming was the most productive in Europe, with the possible exception of the United States. It rivaled the United States. It had the most productive agricultural system in terms of food production per acre and so forth. And the Common Agricultural Policy penalized Britain for its efficiency in order to give subsidies to countries in Southern Europe for being inefficient. You penalize the efficient to reward the inefficient. That was the deal that Britain was getting with the Common Agricultural Policy, among other things. Well, this new budget in Britain, I'm not trying to be political here. Look what it's going to do to the farmers. But who's going to wind up paying for it? How about working families when they go to the supermarket or a grocery shop? How about working families when they go to Tesco's or to Budgeon's or to Morrison's or to Sainsbury's? It's not fair. When you turn away from God, you're going to get godless leaders because you're going to choose godless leaders. Now, even in a pre-democratic world, we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the king you chose. There was no democracy yet. There was none. Government was not to work that way. They think that rights come from governments instead of from God. There are no rights. They're only the privileges they allow you. And they can lie. People were called right-wing extremists in Britain who took to protesting after the children were murdered in Southport. And people were actually prosecuted, brought before magistrates for saying it was terror-related. Now, in the past week, they found out that the murderer had radical Islamic handbooks and toxic, deadly substances he had ricin, or racin. It was terror. It was Islamic terror. Oh, if you say that, we're going to arrest you. That's Islamophobia. That's big. This is the kind of government you get. That's what you chose. A few months ago, taxes are too high. We're not going to have any more taxes. Now there's going to be another 40 billion coming out of the pockets of guess who? When these farmers get scalped, to whom is that going to be passed on to? The consumer. People who have to support themselves and their families. What do you want to do? Turn to God and pray? Verse 18, O Lord, remove him. The Lord will not answer you. He's not going to answer. When you look to a man instead of to the Lord, he's not going to answer. There are Christians in America right now looking to a man because Harris is so evil and Biden is so evil and Donald Trump's previous presidency was rather successful economically and there were no wars. Peace came through strength and so forth. People are looking to him. A lot of saved Christians are looking to him. I'm not saying don't vote for him. I'm not saying don't pray for him. By all means, pray for him. I believe God spared his life. But he's not our salvation. He's not going to save America. Make America great again, unless America gets on its knees and falls before its maker and repents of its sin. It's never going to be great again. No man is going to make it great again. Now, Donald Trump had a great aunt. She was one of the women who met in a cottage for prayer meetings in the Hebrides. Donald Trump owns a major golf resort in two. He owns a smaller one near Aberdeen, but a major one in Turnberry. He has business interests in Scotland. His family were from Scotland. His mother spoke Hebrides Gaelic. He had a mother who could speak that language. His family, he had family who were saved Christians during the time of the revivals of Duncan Campbell. And these revivals went from the Hebrides and Isle of Lewis and all this, and from Stornoway on down and into the Shetlands. Eventually, there was another revival that was engendered by it. It's the only place in Britain you still have a lot of Christians. They fell to their knees and they repented. Scotland is a godless country, apart from there. It's godless. England, Wales, they're godless. Northern Ireland, the Bible Belt of Great Britain, look what happened in its Bible Belt, the bloodbath that went on for nearly 30 years. Is America any better? No. You're not going to make MAGA. You're not going to make America great again by voting for somebody. No. We can pray for the leaders, and we need to. We're told that in Romans. If they're not influenced by our prayers, they're going to be influenced by something else. And God knows I don't want that Harris woman to win. She's wicked and incompetent. And I do believe the Lord spared Donald Trump's life. But he's not going to make America great again. This doesn't work that way. The economic dynamic, the political dynamic, the strategic dynamic, that's what the world looks at. Christians need to be aware of those things, but they also need to be aware of the spiritual dynamic on back of it. You're never going to understand history, politics, and economics unless you understand theology. You're never going to understand what goes wrong in a country and its government unless you understand the Word of God. But what happened when Samuel warned? In 1 Samuel 8. Verse 19, nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we may be like all the other nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. They want somebody to fight their battles for them. No, you won't fight. You won't fight your battles. He'll use you to fight his. When you have a godless leader. Now, after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. And the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice, give them what they want. Ultimately, people are going to do that. Give us a king. And it won't be Jesus. It won't be Christ. The nations are going to say, give us a king. And in the not too distant future, in our lifetime, possibly, but not in the far-reaching future, in their desperation, instead of falling to their knees and calling out to God, they're going to say, give us a king to solve these problems. It won't be Christ. It'll be Antichrist. They'll embrace him. They'll believe him. They will follow him. That is what is going to happen. I'm not saying this is what may happen. I'm saying this is what is going to happen. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen. They said, no, there shall be a king over us. Well, the only king that we should want over us is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. Hamelech Hamlachim. There were people who tried to do this in Scotland, where I am at the moment. They actually tried to make a national covenant. Some of them signed it in blood. They were called the Covenanters, and they were persecuted. They had outdoor meetings and evangelistic crusades in the Grampian Mountains. And they had preachers like Alexander Peden, and they had theologians like Samuel Rutherford and things like this. They were people like that. They wanted to be a covenant nation. Now, again, the only covenant nation is Israel. We cannot have a covenant nation as Christians, but we can have a covenant people. That covenant does not look to government to solve its problems. They don't think that any political or economic or strategic model is going to save their neck or save their future. They know the only one who can save them is Jesus. Yeah, I want to make America great again. I want Great Britain to be great again. Great Britain. I want Great Britain to be great again. It is fitting. It's no longer called Great Britain. It's called the United Kingdom because it's no longer great. I'd like Britain to be great. But to be great, they would have had to listen to people like John Wesley and William Tyndale. They would have had to listen to Charles Spurgeon and Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. That's the only way Britain would be great. Listen to a Duncan Campbell. Nations will get the leaders they deserve. If you're looking for political salvation, you will not be saved. If a nation is looking to be able to have a future by political means, it'll have no future. The political outworkings will always be the ramifications of where the people's hearts are towards God. They will get the leaders they deserve. They will even get a Hitler, a Stalin, a Mao. And if those are not bad enough, they're going to get an Antichrist. Make America great again. Make Great Britain great again. It was not that Britannia ruled the waves. It was not the Royal Navy that made Britain great. They sunk the Armada because God gave them victory. The father of economics as a modern science was the author of a book called The Wealth of Nations. He was from where I am now, Scotland, Adam Smith. He was the patriarch. People like Milton Friedman, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics, Dr. Thomas Sowell, Professor Walter Williams, the free market economist, the monetarist, they all looked to him. He was the patriarch. But it was not his philosophy of economics that made Britain great. It was that they had aristocrats who were servants, not overlords. It was that they had William Wilberforce and the Earl of Shaftesbury. It was people who followed the philosophy of John Wesley based on scripture. Make all you can. Make all the money you can so you can give all you can. A Scottish American born in Scotland in utter poverty became the wealthiest man in the world at one point in history. His name was Andrew Carnegie. He made all these endowments for libraries and universities and things like this, and he was very much governed by biblical principles. I don't know if he was a Christian or not, but he loved the Christian music of Bach, and that's the only music he'd allowed to be played in his house and things like this. He came from Scotland, went to America, had a tremendous influence economically in the industrial world, founder of U.S. Steel, wealthiest man in the world. He was the Elon Musk of his day, the Bill Gates of his day. What did he want the money for? So he can give it away. Make all you can so you can give all you can. If you want to make all you can to accumulate wealth, you're what Jesus warned. The foolish farmer, the wealthy farmer who built 2 barns and his life was required of him that night. A businessman who wants to make money so he can be a philanthropist, that's one thing. A Christian businessman who wants to fund missions and evangelism, that's one thing. If not, their God is not God, their God is mammon. You can always look at the strategic and the economic. You can always look at the things that made nations great. Science. The greatest physicist in history up until Einstein. Isaac Newton came from Britain. He believed in the God of the Bible. Even Einstein, who was not a practicing Christian or Jew, he was Jewish, but he was a theist. He said God does not play dice with the universe. He did not accept random effect. He knew there was a structural order because there was a creator. They at least had a perspective. Einstein said of Jesus, I am a Jew and nothing but a Jew. Yet as a Jew, I'm intrigued, indeed infatuated, with the Jew Jesus of Nazareth. Nobody can dismiss the Gospels as a bon mot. They radiate with his presence. And I say this as a Jew. I have no doubt as to the historicity of Jesus in the New Testament. Now, Einstein was not a Christian or a practicing Jew, although he was Jewish, but that's what he said about Jesus. He at least had the principles. When those things are gone, do you see Warren Buffett talking about God? Do you see the present royal family? The Queen Elizabeth did, but do you see the present royal family talking about God? Do you see Bill Gates talking about God? Do you see Mark Zuckerberg talking about God? I don't. I don't see Bezos talking about God. Now, at one time, there were aristocrats who talked about God. They said, God gave me this ability to make money to benefit others. Greed is not good. Greed is sin. It's mammon worship. It's pride. You can have all the ingredients of a dynamic economy, but it won't last. Look what happened to China. You take God out of it, boom. Japan. It boomed. Post-war Japan boomed. Leveled off in the 1980s, 1990s, boom. Boom. No. Righteousness exalts a nation. There's no man who you choose, no woman who any of us can choose, who can fight our battles for us, because our real battles are always spiritual. Unless we look to God, whose grace and mercy we do not deserve, unless we look to God in Christ, whose grace and mercy we do not deserve, we will wind up with leaders who we do deserve. Thank you so much for listening. My name is James Jacob Prasch from Memorial Ministries.